November 18, 1942. Skies over Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The unnamed pilot of a Japanese Zero gripped his control stick more tightly as he watched the unfamiliar, twin-boom American aircraft rise sharply from the runway below. On this day, the 339th Fighter Squadron's P-38 Lightning pilots engaged Japanese fighters for the first time, launching an encounter that would begin dismantling long-held Japanese beliefs about their supremacy in the air. Twin engines, twin tails, climbing faster than anything we have ever seen. That was the pilot's stunned report upon returning to Rabaul, words that signaled the first fractures in nearly 3 years of Japanese aerial dominance. What he had seen through his canopy defied everything Imperial Navy doctrine had taught him. The P-38 Lightning, an aircraft Japanese intelligence had dismissed as slow, cumbersome, and unsuitable for dogfighting, was rising from sea level to combat altitude at a rate his Mitsubishi A6M Zero simply could not match. From China to the Philippines and over Pearl Harbor, the Zero had ruled the skies. No Allied aircraft could equal its climb, range, or turning ability. But now, over the brutal battleground of Guadalcanal, American pilots and their twin-engine fighters were taking the initiative from altitudes the Zero struggled to reach. During this first engagement, the 339th Squadron's P-38s claimed 3 victories, striking from heights where the Zero's famed agility became irrelevant. The mathematics of who controlled the sky were changing, not in training manuals, but in the undeniable reality of superior altitude and speed performance. For the first time, Japanese pilots felt their confidence slipping. Yet the erosion of Japanese air superiority had begun well before that November encounter, though few in the Imperial Navy recognized it. From December 7, 1941 onward, Japanese aviators had advanced across the Pacific with a reputation bordering on mythic. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, with its extraordinary range, tight turning circle, and well-trained pilots, had dominated early battles. Its top speed of 332 miles per hour at optimal altitude seemed formidable, and its ability to outturn any Allied fighter made it lethal in classic dogfights. Among its most skilled pilots was Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, already a celebrated ace by 1942, hardened by years of combat in China and credited with numerous victories, including 13 during the Borneo campaign before his transfer to Lae, New Guinea, where he would score most of his eventual 64 claims. His confidence mirrored that of the entire Zero fighter corps. Before operations over Guadalcanal, his superior, Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, briefed the squadron confidently. The American aircraft over Guadalcanal likely come from invasion support carriers. They are probably standard Navy fighters, not Army planes. Japanese pilots expected to encounter the familiar F-4F Wildcats aircraft they had defeated repeatedly. Early 1942 seemed to reinforce their belief in unassailable superiority. They tore down outdated Brewster Buffaloes over Singapore, crushed P-40 Warhawks in Java, and outmatched British Hurricanes in Burma. In the first phase of the Pacific War, the Zero seemed nearly untouchable. Even when newer Allied fighters appeared, Japanese pilots maintained control through superior training and combat experience honed during years in China. But intelligence reports trickling into squadrons by mid-1942 spoke of an unusual new American aircraft, 2 engines, 2 tail booms, and concentrated nose-mounted firepower. Something different. Something concerning. November 18, 1942. Skies over Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The unnamed pilot of a Japanese Zero gripped his control stick more tightly as he watched the unfamiliar, twin-boom American aircraft rise sharply from the runway below. On this day, the 339th Fighter Squadron's P-38 Lightning pilots engaged Japanese fighters for the first time, launching an encounter that would begin dismantling long-held Japanese beliefs about their supremacy in the air. Twin engines, twin tails, climbing faster than anything we have ever seen. That was the pilot's stunned report upon returning to Rabaul, words that signaled the first fractures in nearly 3 years of Japanese aerial dominance. What he had seen through his canopy defied everything Imperial Navy doctrine had taught him. The P-38 Lightning, an aircraft Japanese intelligence had dismissed as slow, cumbersome, and unsuitable for dogfighting, was rising from sea level to combat altitude at a rate his Mitsubishi A6M Zero simply could not match. From China to the Philippines and over Pearl Harbor, the Zero had ruled the skies. No Allied aircraft could equal its climb, range, or turning ability. But now, over the brutal battleground of Guadalcanal, American pilots and their twin-engine fighters were taking the initiative from altitudes the Zero struggled to reach. During this first engagement, the 339th Squadron's P-38s claimed 3 victories, striking from heights where the Zero's famed agility became irrelevant. The mathematics of who controlled the sky were changing not in training manuals, but in the undeniable reality of superior altitude and speed performance. For the first time, Japanese pilots felt their confidence slipping. Yet the erosion of Japanese air superiority had begun well before that November encounter, though few in the Imperial Navy recognized it. From December 7, 1941 onward, Japanese aviators had advanced across the Pacific with a reputation bordering on mythic. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, with its extraordinary range, tight turning circle, and well-trained pilots, had dominated early battles. Its top speed of 332 miles per hour at optimal altitude seemed formidable, and its ability to outturn any Allied fighter made it lethal in classic dogfights. Among its most skilled pilots was Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, already a celebrated ace by 1942, hardened by years of combat in China and credited with numerous victories, including 13 during the Borneo campaign before his transfer to New Guinea, where he would score most of his eventual 64 claims. His confidence mirrored that of the entire Zero fighter corps. Before operations over Guadalcanal, his superior, Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, briefed the squadron confidently. The American aircraft over Guadalcanal likely come from invasion support carriers. They are probably standard Navy fighters, not Army planes. Japanese pilots expected to encounter the familiar F-4F Wildcats aircraft they had defeated repeatedly. Early 1942 seemed to reinforce their belief in unassailable superiority. They tore down outdated Brewster Buffaloes over Singapore, crushed P-40 Warhawks in Java, and outmatched British Hurricanes in Burma. In the first phase of the Pacific War, the Zero seemed nearly untouchable. Even when newer Allied fighters appeared, Japanese pilots maintained control through superior training and combat experience honed during years in China. But intelligence reports trickling into squadrons by mid-1942 spoke of an unusual new American aircraft, 2 engines, 2 tail booms, and concentrated nose-mounted firepower. Something different. Something concerning. November 18, 1942, skies over Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The unnamed pilot of a Japanese Zero gripped his control stick more tightly as he watched the unfamiliar, twin-boom American aircraft rise sharply from the runway below. On this day, the 339th Fighter Squadron's P-38 Lightning pilots engaged Japanese fighters for the first time, launching an encounter that would begin dismantling long-held Japanese beliefs about their supremacy in the air. Twin engines, twin tails, climbing faster than anything we have ever seen. That was the pilot's stunned report upon returning to Rabaul, words that signaled the first fractures in nearly 3 years of Japanese aerial dominance. What he had seen through his canopy defied everything Imperial Navy doctrine had taught him. The P-38 Lightning, an aircraft Japanese intelligence had dismissed as slow, cumbersome, and unsuitable for dogfighting, was rising from sea level to combat altitude at a rate his Mitsubishi A6M Zero simply could not match. From China to the Philippines and over Pearl Harbor, the Zero had ruled the skies. No Allied aircraft could equal its climb, range, or turning ability. But now, over the brutal battleground of Guadalcanal, American pilots and their twin-engine fighters were taking the initiative from altitudes the Zero struggled to reach. During this first engagement, the 339th Squadron's P-38s claimed 3 victories, striking from heights where the Zero's famed agility became irrelevant. The mathematics of who controlled the sky were changing not in training manuals, but in the undeniable reality of superior altitude and speed performance. For the first time, Japanese pilots felt their confidence slipping. Yet the erosion of Japanese air superiority had begun well before that November encounter, though few in the Imperial Navy recognized it. From December 7, 1941 onward, Japanese aviators had advanced across the Pacific with a reputation bordering on mythic. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, with its extraordinary range, tight turning circle, and well-trained pilots, had dominated early battles. Its top speed of 332 miles per hour at optimal altitude seemed formidable, and its ability to outturn any Allied fighter made it lethal in classic dogfights. Among its most skilled pilots was Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, already a celebrated ace by 1942, hardened by years of combat in China and credited with numerous victories, including 13 during the Borneo campaign before his transfer to New Guinea, where he would score most of his eventual 64 claims. His confidence mirrored that of the entire Zero fighter corps. Before operations over Guadalcanal, his superior, Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, briefed the squadron confidently. The American aircraft over Guadalcanal likely come from invasion support carriers. They are probably standard Navy fighters, not Army planes. Japanese pilots expected to encounter the familiar F-4F Wildcats aircraft they had defeated repeatedly. Early 1942 seemed to reinforce their belief in unassailable superiority. They tore down outdated Brewster Buffaloes over Singapore, crushed P-40 Warhawks in Java, and outmatched British Hurricanes in Burma. In the first phase of the Pacific War, the Zero seemed nearly untouchable. Even when newer Allied fighters appeared, Japanese pilots maintained control through superior training and combat experience honed during years in China. But intelligence reports trickling into squadrons by mid-1942 spoke of an unusual new American aircraft, 2 engines, 2 tail booms, and concentrated nose-mounted firepower. Something different. Something concerning. The reports were dismissed by most squadron commanders. How could a twin-engine fighter possibly threaten the nimble Zero? Japanese naval doctrine built on the concept of the decisive battle and individual combat skill had no framework for understanding what was coming. The Lightning emerges. The P-38 Lightning was the only really successful twin-engine daytime fighter of the war. The result of Lohate's response to a February 1937 U.S. Army Air Corps specification for a long-range interceptor. Designer Clarence Kelly Johnson and his team had created something unprecedented. A fighter that could exceed 400 miles per hour, climb to 40,000 feet, and carry enough fuel for missions exceeding 1,000 miles. The P-38's twin Allison V11710 engines, each producing 1,150 horsepower with turbo-supercharging, gave it performance characteristics that seemed impossible to Japanese engineers. While the Zero had been designed for maximum maneuverability with minimum weight, even lacking armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks in early models, the Lightning represented a different philosophy entirely. Speed, altitude, firepower, and survivability. The first P-38s arrived in the Pacific Theater not with fanfare, but with mechanical problems. When the first P-38s arrived in Australia, they were discovered to have some design problems and their combat debut was delayed. But by late 1942, these issues were being resolved and experienced pilots from P-40 squadrons were transitioning to the new fighter. The 49th Fighter Group was still equipped with P-40s, but would soon transition to the Lightning. These pilots brought with them hard-won experience against Japanese fighters. They had learned, often through fatal trial and error, never to engage a Zero in a turning fight. The P-38 would give them the tool to fight on their own terms. First blood over the Solomons. November 18, 1942 marked the Lightning's first major engagement with Japanese fighters when pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal engaged Japanese aircraft while escorting Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. The results stunned both sides. Japanese pilots flying escort for their bombers first spotted the strange twin boom silhouettes climbing from the south. Their initial reaction was confusion. Were these bombers reconnaissance aircraft? The rate of climb suggested neither. By the time they recognized them as fighters, the P-38s had already gained a 5,000-foot altitude advantage. The P-38s would patrol above the altitude at which the Zero could effectively operate. Their great speed at high altitudes allowed them to maneuver into the most advantageous positions. Then the big fighters would plunge from the sky to smash into the hapless Zero fighters. The mathematics were stark. While the Zero's low-speed maneuverability was legendary, its high-speed maneuverability was actually inferior to the P-38 at altitude. Above 250 miles per hour, the Zero's controls became increasingly heavy. Above 300 miles per hour, the aircraft became difficult to maneuver at all. The P-38, with its hydraulically boosted controls in later models, maintained effectiveness even in high-speed dives approaching 500 miles per hour. The technological chasm. The shock for Japanese pilots went beyond mere performance numbers. The P-38 represented a fundamentally different approach to aerial warfare that Japanese military culture had not anticipated. The Lightning's armament, 450 caliber machine guns and 120 mm cannon concentrated in the nose, delivered devastating firepower in a focused stream that didn't require the complex gun convergence calculations of wing-mounted weapons. The turbo-supercharged engines were equally revolutionary to Japanese understanding. The P-38's turbo-superchargers made it one of the earliest Allied fighters capable of performing well at high altitudes while also muffling the exhaust, making the P-38's operation relatively quiet. Japanese pilots often didn't hear the P-38's approaching until it was too late. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, which produced about 950 horsepower at sea level, suffered a severe loss of performance as altitude increased. By 20,000 feet it could barely generate 750 horsepower. In contrast, the P-38's turbo-supercharged Allison engines maintained strong power at high altitudes, giving the American fighter a decisive edge in vertical combat. Psychological effects of technological disadvantage. By early 1943, the emotional strain on Japanese pilots was becoming clear in unit records and personal correspondence. The long-standing belief in the Zero's unmatched superiority, carefully promoted since its first appearance in China, was falling apart. Pilots wrote of constant anxiety, aware that a P-38 could attack from any direction with little warning. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima experienced a now famous coordinated maneuver by American pilots. Two Wildcats pounced on him. Although he managed to get behind one of them, he never had a chance to fire before the second Grumman fighter swept in from the side. Nakajima returned to Rabaul furious, having been forced to dive away to survive. Yet even this encounter with Wildcats paled compared to what the P-38 would later bring. Saburo Sakai himself later acknowledged that Zero pilots could rarely challenge the P-38 successfully except in the most unusual circumstances, situations that almost never occurred. For Japan's most celebrated ace to admit this carried enormous weight among the pilot corps. The tactical picture was even grimmer than individual dogfight accounts suggested. With long-range drop tanks giving it a reach of roughly 1,600 miles, the P-38 could appear almost anywhere in the Pacific. It could escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory or conduct long-distance sweeps far from American bases. Japanese airmen could no longer rely on having numerical advantages even over their own islands. The Yamamoto mission, the ultimate proof. No event showcased the P-38's dominance more clearly than Operation Vengeance on April 18, 1943. 16 P-38s carried out a 435-mile interception to shoot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The mission demanded pinpoint navigation over open ocean, extreme range capability, and the ability to defeat both bombers and their fighter escorts. Major John Mitchell led the formation at just 50 feet above the waves to evade radar, before climbing sharply to the interception point. The psychological blow to Japanese naval aviation was immense. Their most respected commander, flying with 6 Zero escorts, had been located, intercepted, and killed by American fighters operating at the very limits of their reach. Zero pilot Kenji Yanaga, who was part of Yamamoto's escort, described the shock among Japanese aviators. The P-38s had seemingly materialized from nowhere, carried out their attack with deadly accuracy, and vanished before the Zeros could counterattack. The Americans timed the interception down to the exact minute, striking when Yamamoto's formation was descending to land, its most vulnerable moment. This blend of meticulous planning and superior aircraft performance demonstrated capabilities Japan could not match. Tactical evolution and adaptation. As 1943 continued, U.S. pilots refined tactics to exploit every advantage of the P-38. Boom and zoom attacks, diving from above, firing, then climbing out of reach before the enemy could react, became routine. Japanese pilots increasingly found themselves unable to defend against these high-energy assaults. The first air-to-air encounter between the Japanese and the P-38 resulted in 15 Japanese shot down to only one P-38. These lopsided victories became increasingly common as American pilots gained experience with their new mount. The Japanese attempted various countermeasures. They tried using dive brakes to force overshooting attacks. They attempted to lure P-38s into low-altitude turning fights. They even developed new loose formations to better spot incoming attacks. Nothing worked consistently. The performance gap was simply too large. Industrial reality behind the performance. The P-38's superiority reflected a deeper truth about American industrial capability that Japanese pilots were only beginning to grasp. By war's end, over 10,000 P-38s would be manufactured with 18 distinct models representing continuous improvement. Each new variant addressed weaknesses and enhanced strengths based on combat experience. The P-38J model, arriving in late 1943, incorporated hydraulically boosted ailerons to improve roll rate, addressed cockpit heating issues that had plagued earlier models in Europe, and featured improved turbo-superchargers for even better altitude performance. Japanese aircraft development, meanwhile, struggled to produce incremental improvements to the Zero design. Captain Minoru Gender, the tactical genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack, privately admitted to colleagues in mid-1943, "We are not just facing a superior fighter. We are facing a system of continuous improvement we cannot match. Each new American fighter we encounter is better than the last." The pilot experienced divergence. The technological gap was amplified by diverging pilot quality. By mid-1943, Japan was losing its experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. The grim realities of Japan being unable to adequately replace war losses in materials and skill were becoming apparent. Training programs were shortened from 2 years to less than 6 months. New pilots arrived at combat units with less than 200 hours of flight time. American pilots, conversely, were arriving with 400 to 600 hours of training. They had practiced combat tactics in advanced training units, studied gun camera footage from actual combats, and trained on multiple aircraft types. When they transitioned to P-38s, they received specialized training in twin-engine operations and high-altitude combat tactics. Mechanical complexity and reliability. The P-38's twin-engine configuration provided another advantage Japanese pilots hadn't fully appreciated: survivability. With 2 engines, even severely damaged Lightnings could limp home on a single propeller. The psychological impact of this reliability was profound. Japanese pilots flying single-engine aircraft over vast stretches of ocean faced death if their engine failed. The Zero's extreme range came at the cost of minimal armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. A single bullet in the wrong place meant a fiery death or a long swim in shark-infested waters. The intelligence war. By late 1943, Japanese intelligence warned pilots to avoid duels with the Lightning, noting its terrifying diving speed, accuracy, and ability to appear unexpectedly. These intelligence reports circulated among Japanese squadrons revealed a growing understanding of their disadvantage. One captured Japanese document from December 1943 stated, "The P-38 type fighter must be considered the most dangerous American aircraft in the Pacific. Its speed and climb rate exceed anything we can achieve. Engagement should be avoided unless possessing overwhelming numerical superiority and advantageous position." This admission that Japanese pilots should avoid combat with American fighters represented a complete reversal of the warrior ethic that had defined Japanese naval aviation. The psychological impact was devastating. Pilots who had been trained to seek combat at every opportunity were now being told to run from the enemy. The aces tell the tale. The emergence of American P-38 aces provided stark evidence of the fighter's superiority. Major Richard I Boeing became America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories, all scored in P-38s. Major Thomas B. McGuire achieved 38 victories before being killed in January 1945. These scores, achieved in less than 2 years of combat, exceeded what most Japanese aces had accomplished in 3 or 4 years of war. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft would fall to P-38s in the Pacific theater. This tally represented not just aircraft destroyed, but experienced pilots lost. Pilots Japan could never replace. Each victory diminished Japanese air power exponentially as training programs struggled to produce even basically competent replacements. Technical innovation continues. As 1944 progressed, the P-38 continued to evolve while Japanese aircraft development stagnated. The P-38L model featured uprated engines producing even more power at altitude, improved cooling systems, and rocket launchers for ground attack missions. These aircraft could carry substantial bomb loads in addition to their standard armament. Japanese pilots watching P-38's transition from air superiority missions to devastating ground attacks realized they were facing not just a superior fighter, but a weapons system of unprecedented versatility. The cultural shock. Beyond the technological superiority, Japanese pilots struggled to comprehend the American approach to air combat. The Japanese had elevated aerial combat to an art form, emphasizing individual skill and warrior spirit. The Americans treated it as an engineering problem to be solved with superior technology and tactics. Commander Masatake Kiyomiya, a staff officer who analyzed combat reports, wrote, "After the war, we could not accept that fighting spirit alone was insufficient. Every report of P-38's superiority was met with demands for greater dedication, more aggressive spirit. We confused courage with capability. This cultural blindness prevented effective adaptation. While American pilots continuously refined tactics based on combat experience, Japanese training continued to emphasize aerobatic skill and individual combat prowess. Skills useless against an enemy that refused to engage on those terms. The radar revolution. By mid-1944, some P-38s were equipped with primitive airborne radar for night fighting operations. This technology was completely beyond Japanese capability to match or counter. Night had previously been a sanctuary for Japanese operations. Now even darkness offered no protection. The Marianas Turkey Shoot. While the P-38 didn't participate directly in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, its impact was felt in the quality of Japanese pilots who faced the U.S. Navy's Hellcats. Years of attrition against P-38s and other American fighters had eliminated Japan's experienced pilots. The Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft for minimal losses, was the culmination of a process the P-38 had accelerated. Vice Admiral Tao Ozawa, commanding the Japanese carrier forces, later admitted, "Our pilots were not ready. They had neither the experience nor the aircraft to match the Americans." The war in the air had been lost long before that day. Desperation and innovation. As 1944 turned to 1945, Japanese attempts to counter the P-38 became increasingly desperate. They experimented with ramming attacks, recognizing that conventional combat was hopeless. They developed phosphorus anti-aircraft shells specifically to target the P-38's fuel tanks. They even attempted to develop their own twin-engine fighters, though none reached operational status in meaningful numbers. The Kawasaki Ki-102, Japan's attempt at a twin-engine fighter comparable to the P-38, demonstrated the technological gap. While the P-38 had been operational since 1941, the Ki-102 didn't enter service until 1945, and only 238 were built. It was slower than the P-38, climbed poorly, and suffered from chronic engine problems. The end of air superiority. By early 1945, Japanese pilots no longer spoke of air superiority or even air power. They spoke of survival. The P-38, along with other American fighters, had established complete dominance over Japanese airspace. Saburo Sakai himself would later state that the P-38 destroyed the morale of the Zero fighter pilot. The numbers tell the story. The statistics of P-38 operations in the Pacific tell a story of overwhelming superiority. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft destroyed by P-38s, Major Richard Bong, 40 victories, all in P-38s, Major Thomas Maguire. 38 victories in P-38s, P-38 pilots claimed more Japanese aircraft than any other Army Air Force fighter. Against these achievements, Japanese loss rates told a grimmer story. By war's end, Japan had lost over 90% of its experienced pilots who had begun the war. The average Japanese pilot in 1945 had less than 100 hours of flight time. They were not warriors, but sacrificial lambs sent against an enemy they had no hope of defeating. Post-war revelations. After Japan's surrender, American occupation forces conducted extensive interviews with surviving Japanese pilots and commanders. These interviews revealed the full extent of the psychological impact the P-38 had inflicted. Commander Masatake Okumiya admitted, "The P-38 broke our confidence completely. We had believed in our superiority, in our aircraft, in our training. The lightning showed us we were wrong about everything. It wasn't just faster or better armed. It represented a way of war we couldn't match." One Japanese pilot interviewed stated, "On my first confrontation with the P-38, I was astonished to find an American aircraft that could outrun, outclimb, and outdive our Zero, which we thought was the most superior fighter plane in the world." The technical analysis. Post-war technical analysis revealed the full extent of the performance gap. Mitsubishi A6M maximum speed 332 miles per hour at critical altitude. Service ceiling 33,000 feet struggling above 25,000. Climb rate 3,100 feet per minute, decreasing rapidly with altitude. Range 1,930 miles. Exceptional for its time. Armament, 2 7.7 mm machine guns, 2 20 mm cannon, limited ammunition. Armor, none in early models. Self-sealing fuel tanks, none in early models. Lockheed P-38L Lightning maximum speed over 400 miles per hour. Service ceiling 44,000 feet, climb rate 4,750 feet per minute at sea level. Range 1,600 m with drop tanks. Armament 450 caliber machine guns, 120 mm cannon, armor, extensive pilot protection, self-sealing fuel tank standard. The numbers revealed a complete mismatch. The Zero had been designed for a different war, one where individual combat skill and maneuverability determined victory. The P-38 represented industrial-age warfare where technology, production capacity, and systematic improvement determine outcomes. The industrial context. The P-38's superiority reflected American industrial might that dwarfed Japanese capacity. Lockheed produced over 10,000 P-38s during the war. Japan produced approximately 10,000 Zeros total, but spread over a longer period and with declining quality as the war progressed. American production methods utilizing assembly line techniques perfected in automobile manufacturing could produce P-38s faster than Japan could train pilots. Each P-38 incorporated thousands of specialized components manufactured to precise tolerances, a testament to American industrial coordination that Japan couldn't replicate. The Allison engines powering the P-38 were masterpieces of engineering, incorporating supercharging technology, precision manufacturing, and metallurgy beyond Japanese capabilities. While Japanese engines required extensive hand fitting and adjustment, American engines were essentially interchangeable, simplifying maintenance and improving reliability. The training disparity. By 1944, the gap in pilot training had become a chasm. American P-38 pilots received specialized twin-engine training, including 100-plus hours on twin-engine trainers before touching a P-38. Engine-out procedures and asymmetric thrust management. High-altitude physiology and oxygen system management. Gunnery training using camera guns and towed targets. Formation tactics and mutual support procedures. Escape and evasion training. Comprehensive aircraft systems knowledge. Japanese training by 1944 consisted of basic flight instruction 50 to 100 hours, minimal combat tactics training, limited gunnery practice, ammunition was scarce, no specialized high-altitude training, emphasis on spirit over tactical doctrine, preparation for special attack kamikaze missions. The result was predictable. American pilots arrived in theater as skilled professionals. Japanese pilots arrived as barely competent sacrifices. Tactical evolution. The P-38 forced fundamental changes in aerial combat tactics. The traditional turning dogfight, which had dominated aerial combat since World War I, became obsolete. While the P-38 could not outturn the A6M Zero when flying below 200 miles per hour, its superior speed coupled with good rate of climb meant it could use energy tactics effectively. American pilots developed the high side pass, approaching from above and behind, diving through the enemy formation with guns blazing, then zooming back to altitude before the enemy could react. This tactic, impossible without the P-38's performance advantages, rendered Japanese defensive formations useless. The Japanese attempted to adapt by stationing fighters at multiple altitudes, but this dispersed their forces and made coordination impossible. They tried using clouds for concealment, but the P-38's speed allowed it to cover vast areas quickly, finding Japanese aircraft wherever they tried to hide. The psychological warfare component. The distinctive appearance of the P-38 became a psychological weapon. Its twin-boom design looked alien to Japanese pilots who initially dismissed it as heavy and clumsy. This unique silhouette, however, became a symbol of American technological superiority that struck fear into Japanese pilots long before combat was joined. Ground crews reported that the mere rumor of P-38s in the area would cause Japanese pilots to delay missions or request additional escorts. The aircraft's nickname among Japanese pilots, 2 planes, 1 pilot, reflected both confusion about its design and respect for its capabilities. Strategic impact. The P-38's superiority had strategic implications beyond tactical air combat. Japanese military planning had assumed rough air parity would allow their superior warrior spirit to prevail. The P-38 demonstrated that technology could create such overwhelming advantage that spirit became irrelevant. This realization influenced Japanese strategic decisions, including acceleration of kamikaze tactics as conventional air combat became hopeless, withdrawal of remaining experienced pilots to home island defense, abandonment of offensive air operations by mid-1944, diversion of resources to desperate wonder weapon projects, recognition that the war was unwinnable by conventional means. Admiral Somu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, privately acknowledged in October 1944, "We no longer have an air force capable of conventional operations. The American fighters, especially the P-38, have eliminated our ability to contest the skies." The maintenance and logistics victory. The P-38's twin-engine complexity initially concerned American planners, but it demonstrated another American advantage: sophisticated maintenance and logistics capabilities. P-38 squadrons maintained operational rates exceeding 80% even in primitive Pacific conditions. Japanese units flying simpler single-engine fighters struggled to maintain 50% availability by 1944. American maintenance crews, many recruited from civilian aviation and automotive industries, brought systematic approaches to aircraft maintenance. They developed specialized tools, standardized procedures, and preventive maintenance schedules. Japanese maintenance remained largely traditional, relying on individual skill rather than systematic procedures. The navigation technology gap. P-38s equipped with radio direction finding equipment could navigate accurately over vast Pacific distances. They could home in on radio beacons, find their bases in poor weather, and conduct precise time-on-target attacks. Japanese pilots still relied primarily on dead reckoning and visual navigation, limiting their operational flexibility. This navigation advantage became critical during long-range missions. The Yamamoto interception mission required precise navigation over 435 miles of open ocean, arriving at the exact point at the exact time. Japanese pilots couldn't have executed such a mission with their available technology. The impact on Japanese naval aviation. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its entire strategic doctrine around naval aviation. The P-38's dominance shattered this foundation. Carrier air groups rebuilt after Midway losses were decimated by P-38s and other American fighters during island campaigns. By 1944, Japanese carriers sailed with half-strength air group-ups of poorly trained pilots. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, commanding the first mobile fleet, reported before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, "Our pilots are not ready for combat against American fighters. They can barely land on carriers, much less fight P-38s and Hellcats. We are sending them to certain death." The cultural transformation. The encounter with the P-38 forced a fundamental transformation in Japanese military thinking. The Bushido Code emphasizing spiritual strength and individual warrior prowess proved inadequate against American industrial warfare. Younger Japanese officers began questioning the entire basis of Japanese military doctrine. This cultural transformation extended beyond the military. Japanese pilots returning from combat, those few who survived, brought stories of American technological superiority that contradicted years of propaganda about Western decadence and Japanese spiritual superiority. The economic reality. The P-38 program represented an economic investment Japan couldn't match. Each P-38 cost approximately $97,000 in 1944. Expensive, but America produced them by the thousands. Japan struggled to produce aircraft costing a fraction of that amount in meaningful numbers. The aluminum required for a single P-38 exceeded what many Japanese aircraft factories received in a month by 1944. The precision instruments, the turbo-superchargers, the constant speed propellers, each component represented industrial capabilities Japan had never developed. The pilot testimony. The most powerful evidence of the P-38's impact comes from Japanese pilot testimonies. These men, trained to never admit weakness, universally acknowledged the lightning's superiority in post-war interviews. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai. The P-38 would patrol above the altitude at which the Zero could fly. Their great speed at high altitudes allowed them to maneuver into the most advantageous positions. Then the big fighters would plunge from the sky to smash into the hapless Zero fighters. The ultimate humiliation. Perhaps the greatest humiliation came not from combat losses, but from the P-38's other capabilities. P-38 reconnaissance variants obtained 90% of the aerial photography in the Pacific theater. Japanese positions, movements, and preparations were constantly observed. The same aircraft that dominated them in combat was mapping their defeat in detail. Japanese commanders realized their every move was watched, photographed, analyzed. The P-38 F-5 photo reconnaissance variant, stripped of weapons but retaining full performance, could photograph Japanese installations with impunity. Japanese fighters sent to intercept them simply couldn't reach their altitude. The legacy of shock. The shock Japanese pilots experienced when encountering the P-38 extended far beyond the war. It influenced post-war Japanese aviation development, military doctrine, and even cultural attitudes toward technology versus tradition. Many surviving Japanese pilots became advocates for technological advancement in post-war Japan. They had learned firsthand that courage without capability was meaningless. Their experiences influenced Japan's post-war embrace of technology and industrial development. Saburo Sakai, who became a successful businessman after the war, often spoke about the lessons learned from facing the P-38. The lightning taught us that we must never again fall behind technologically. It showed us that industrial power, not warrior spirit, determines victory in modern war. The technical innovation race. The P-38's evolution during the war demonstrated American advantages in rapid technical innovation. Problems identified in combat were quickly addressed in new production models. Compressibility issues led to dive flaps. Cold cockpits led to improved heating systems. Roll rate complaints led to hydraulically boosted ailerons. Japanese aircraft development constrained by limited resources and institutional rigidity couldn't match this pace of improvement. The Zero that fought in 1945 was essentially the same aircraft that had attacked Pearl Harbor with minor improvements. The P-38L of 1945 was dramatically superior to the P-38E of 1942. The final assessment, General Kenney, who commanded Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, famously remarked that P-38 pilots, operating at high altitude, chose the moment and place of battle, and the results for Japanese aviators were catastrophic. This ability to dictate when combat occurred marked a transformation in aerial warfare, one the Japanese were never able to counter within their existing doctrine. The numbers tell the story bluntly. By the end of the war, America's two leading aces, both flying P-38 Lightnings, had a combined total of 78 confirmed kills. Japan's highest-scoring surviving ace finished with 64 victories gathered over 6 years of conflict. Japan simply could not sustain such losses. The attrition mathematics were fatal. Wider meaning and consequences. The P-38's superiority over the Zero reflected more than faster engines or better climb performance. It exposed fundamental contrasts in military philosophy, national industry, technological development, and long-term planning. Japan had geared itself for a fast, decisive conflict won through pilot skill and warrior ethos. The P-38 embodied the opposite. War is a long-term industrial struggle where engineering, production lines, and scientific problem-solving ruled the battlefield. For many Japanese pilots, the terror they felt on encountering the P-38 was actually the shock of facing modern industrial warfare for the first time. The Lightning symbolized a society that treated war as an engineering challenge rather than a test of personal courage. Against that, samurai spirit, however revered, offered no solution. The human reality. Behind every statistic was a young pilot in a cockpit. Thousands of inexperienced Japanese airmen, some with less than 100 hours of training, were thrown into combat in outdated machines. Many understood they had almost no hope of surviving. Letters found after the war reveal heartbreaking resignation. One airman wrote to his mother before flying his final mission. "Tomorrow I will face the twin-tailed devils. I do not think I will come home. They fly faster and higher than we can dream. I will fulfill my duty, but I know it is hopeless." He was shot down over Rabaul in March 1944. His story was one among thousands young men sacrificed to a technological gap that bravery alone could never bridge. Lasting legacy. The P-38's influence continued long after 1945. Its design and operational success shaped Cold War aircraft development, inspiring twin-engine, high-altitude interceptors in both the United States and the Soviet Union. Its philosophy, using advanced technology to secure overwhelming battlefield advantage, became a pillar of American military strategy. For Japan, the trauma of fighting at such a technological disadvantage reshaped post-war defense doctrine. The self-defense forces embraced cutting-edge technology and precision engineering over mass mobilization. The psychological wounds of technological inferiority never completely faded. Conclusion: the close of a historic era. When Japanese pilots realized they could neither outrun nor outclimb the P-38 Lightning, a chapter in air combat history closed forever. The era of the lone warrior pilot deciding victory through personal skill had ended. Industrial-age air warfare, driven by technology, manufacturing scale, and scientific innovation, had replaced I. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most celebrated surviving ace, later reflected that the P-38 broke the spirit of the Zero pilots. He understood that its significance went far beyond speed or altitude. The Lightning represented a mode of warfare Japan could not counter, a union of industry and science that rendered old doctrines obsolete. The Zero, seemingly untouchable in 1941, was obsolete by 1943. Japanese pilots who had spent years perfecting aerobatic dogfighting skills suddenly found themselves powerless against an adversary that refused to fight on their terms. Ultimately, the twin-tailed devil that haunted Japanese pilots symbolized more than a better airplane. It embodied American technological strength and the industrial power that would shape the latter half of the 20th century. Sakai summarized it best: the P-38 proved that the age of the samurai was over. In the skies above the Pacific, Japan met modernity, and it was overwhelming. The shock of that encounter still echoes, illustrating a brutal truth: in modern warfare, courage without technology leads not to victory but to needless sacrifice. The Japanese pilots who could not evade the Lightning learned this lesson with their lives, their aircraft, and the collapse of their nation's imperial ambitions. The P-38 was the answer of the industrial world, delivered at 400 miles per hour from 30,000 feet with a level of precision no amount of bravery could overcome.